Next is Joachim Voth.
Okay, well, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you. So in these days, as often happens, my mind is cast back to times long distant. And in 1348, as the Black Death was spreading throughout Europe, and people were faced with a catastrophe of unknown proportions, with half the population dying, they looked for some reason why this discontinuity and terrible event was happening. And some people felt that, always need somebody to blame, so surely the Jews poisoned the wells and didn't treat them very kindly. And other people felt that a irritated God was punishing them for their transgressions, and the best way to atone for their sins was to strip off their shirts and start beating each other's backs in all sorts of ways. And then hopefully with the blood pouring down into the provided shirts, eventually appease the vengeful God. And every crisis has some element like this. There must be something in the human psyche that makes us go for forms of self-flagellation. In 2001, following the Nasdaq crisis and the corporate scandals like Enron, we're beating the backs of managers and day traders and corporate greed. And today, it seems to be our job to take the fall. So I actually went back to some of the origins of this collective soul-searching, a piece by Paul Krugman in the New York Times in 2009. And let me just cite very briefly two of the things that caught my eye here and try to organize my thoughts around that. So Paul Krugman says, "Few economists saw our current crisis coming, but this predictive failure was the least of the field's problems. More important was the profession's blindness to the very possibility of catastrophic failures in a market economy. During the golden years, financial economists came to believe that markets were inherently stable, indeed that stocks and other assets were always priced just right. There was nothing in the prevailing model suggesting the possibility of the kind of collapse that happened last year." Okay? And I think what Paul is articulating, and one of the reasons why people jumped at this, is that he's articulating something that many non-economists think too. So society at large pays a bunch of, on average, pretty clever guys and girls to think long and hard about matters economic: growth, unemployment, incentives, market structures. And what do they get in return? They get the kind of math they always hated in school. They get no predictions worth having, and crises that are very painful. And some of them are even more painful than they were 20 or 40 years ago. So it's a very appealing critique in some ways. It's simple, it sounds reflected, it has the self-flagellating aspect since he's a leading practitioner, and as far as I'm concerned, it's almost all wrong. The first issue that other people have touched on is that prediction really isn't our business. So I was trying to think of why that is, and I think meteorology is a perfectly respectable science. We understand a lot about the effect of high and low pressure areas, of clouds, the Gulf Stream, and so forth. And if you ask a meteorologist whether you should get married in 3 months on that Saturday, they don't have a clue. And it's not that they don't understand, it's just that things are too complex to turn out sensible forecasts. So the soul searching, of course, goes beyond that, and Paul Krugman touched on many of these aspects. And I have to say, having spent a little bit of time in Princeton, that I'm not quite sure where Paul Krugman's been hanging out in the last decade or so. So few of the things he has to say about modern finance, as I see it, chimes with anything that I know. Just across the lawn from Fisher Hall in Princeton is Bentheim Center, and it's full of world-class economists that very much publish in the mainstream, like Marcus Brunnermeier and Harrison Hong, Yun Shin and Wei Chong, and they write models in which everybody knows that there's a bubble going on, and you're not going to attack it. Why don't you do that? Well, because you alone can't prick it. Okay? And Brunnermeier calls it synchronization risk, so you're not going to jump in and actually put your reputation on the line and lose assets under management because your investors think that you just don't get the internet. Okay? And then they close up your fund, like the Robertson Fund, in March 2000, just before prices turn. And we've spent a decade writing things like that. And I just don't see this large crowd of market jihadis that think that the efficient market hypothesis in its pure form is actually right. Okay, and much of this is in the mainstream now, and experimentalists back it up, and so forth. Now, turning to the causes, why didn't we actually know more about this or see more things being done to stop asset prices getting out of line. I think we don't have good stories as a profession for why it is that we get so many bubbles now when there were so few for so long. One of the things that's striking, if you actually look closer, is just how boring this crisis is. So we have these stories about how handing on risks creates these chains of dominoes, and that's the source of instability. But much of what actually happened is that because you could do things off balance sheet, you could actually leverage more. We always knew that you should limit leverage, and the regulators were just asleep at the wheel. And it's not our collective job to take their driver's license away. If you want to talk about what goes wrong, if a regulator says you keep all the risk, but the risk requirement, the capital requirement now is not 8%, but it's 0.5 or 1.6 or something, you have to talk political economy. I don't think you have to talk economics. So where do we go from here, since I'm running out of time? So the one area in which I see some merit in some of the thoughts that Krugman's articulated is in macro proper. So I don't think that every leading practitioner of the great moderation literature will look back at every single one of their comments with full pride. I always thought it was sailing slightly close to the wind to make so much out of the fact that just one big bad crisis seemed to be taking a bit longer in arriving. And there are papers like the now infamous Chari, Cristiano, and Kehoe paper claiming that there was no crisis, and if anything ever turned down, it was clearly the government's fault, that didn't exactly cover the profession in glory. But the broader claims by critics such as Krugman that the economics as a field has been captured by ideology, that it's been bought by Wall Street, the Hoover Institution, and prospects of playing golf in Stanford just isn't right. So I think there are things that we don't understand fully, and Jaume has alluded to many of them in a much clearer and better way than I ever could. I expect we're going to see much more work going beyond work by Bernanke, Gertler, and Kiyotaki, more trying to connect the real side of the economy with the financial sector, and I think that's where we're going to see most of the work. I think it'll be not just business as usual, it'll be more exciting and with bigger implications, and if anything should happen, it's that we should probably be listened more to afterwards than before.
Thanks a lot, Joachim.